guys, it's Kira and welcome to another video. Somehow it is already November and we are literally almost at the end of 2020, which is wild. And that means it is time for my, not quite penultimate, is it threnultimate? The third to last reading wrap up of the year, basically. What I'm trying to say in the most messy way possible is that today I'm going to be talking you through all of the books that I managed to read in the month of October. And I am so happy to say that I actually found my love of reading again this month. As you might remember from my September reading wrap up, it was a terrible month, a truly terrible month. Not so much in the fact that I didn't read that much, because sometimes we have those months where we just don't have as much time for reading, and to be fair, that was the case in September, but it was more so my feelings towards reading in September were just really negative. I had pretty much no motivation or desire to read, and I was just struggling to get through anything. And so I'm really happy that in October that has changed. I found my love of reading again. I did manage to read quite a bit more than I read last month, but most importantly, I enjoyed it and I actually wanted to read, which was the biggest change that I was looking for, and I'm so happy about it. So throughout October, I managed to read a total of 7 books. So I have quite a lot more to talk about than I did last month, and we all know I can talk for England, so let's jump straight into it. The first book that I picked up in October was definitely a cover buy, but it paid off. Cover buys can always be kind of risky, but this one definitely worked out, and it was The Truance by Kate Weinberg. The cover of this book to me was so intriguing because it is such a bright yellow at the top, and I love yellow. It's one of my favourite colours. It's just so bright and impossible to ignore, and it's also usually a very happy colour, but then underneath that yellow we have this really stark and quite mysterious scene with 3 characters surrounding a hearse or a funeral car, and it looks so dark, and by contrast to this really bright yellow at the top, it was just so intriguing to me and I really wanted to know more. And then the blurb of this book, one of the quotes from a newspaper, which is The Times, says, "As much of a coming-of-age tale as a murder mystery," and that sounded really intriguing as well, and so I jumped straight into this book and luckily really liked it and gave it 4 stars. It is, however, a book that I think is really difficult to explain because it is very complex and does lots of different things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to happen all in one book, and yet Kate Weinberg managed to do them all so well. So at its core, I would say this is a coming-of-age tale of sorts, and we follow our main character Jess, who is in her first year of university. Jess is kind of a bit of an outsider. She doesn't necessarily fit in with or like her big family that much, and she really wants to get away from her small hometown. And so we see her at university sort of trying to put herself out there and find her place in the world and in society and in university, and just figure out where she fits and what kind of existence she wants to lead. And then very quickly she becomes involved in some really intense relationships. First of all, she makes friends with this girl called Georgie, who becomes her best friend very quickly. And then both Jess and Georgie get involved in some romantic relationships, which ends up leading them into this group of 4 friends made up of Jess, Georgie, and their 2 boyfriends. And this is a really odd friendship group because the characters don't necessarily seem like characters who'd get on or match each other. And yet there is just such an intense connection between them all, which becomes very complicated because the lines between friendship and romance become quite blurred in a way that at first seems fun and exciting, but very quickly becomes quite a dark source of tension. And then aside from her relationships with these friends, Jess also has quite an important and another intense relationship with one of her lecturers called Lorna. Lorna is really the inspiration behind Jess's entire university experience because Lorna is an author who wrote a book called The Truance. And because of Jess's transformative experience with this book, she decided that she wanted to go to the university where Lorna is a lecturer, and was really desperate to get into her classes so that she could have some kind of connection with her, which actually comes to fruition because Lorna and Jess then have this very intense, quite close relationship which has quite blurred boundaries. And as we get to know Lorna as a character, it would seem that Jess isn't the first student that she's had this kind of relationship with. And so this book is one which has some really, really intense, complex relationships, and these relationships are all so interconnected. And for that reason, I found this book really similar to the reading experience that I had with Sally Rooney's books. They're obviously very much focused on complex romantic relationships, but in particular, Conversations with Friends looks at the ways that all relationships interconnect, and that even when relationships don't actually interconnect in the sense that not all of the people know each other, they interconnect in the sense that your experience with one person and relationship with one person will inevitably impact the way that you react to and behave with other people. And I feel like the way that we see these characters interacting in the truance is really a testament to how those complex relationships and webs of friendships, romances and acquaintances can cross over in quite dramatic ways. And then, as I mentioned in the quote from the back of this book, this is also a murder mystery of sorts. First of all, this is a book which is very much concerned with Agatha Christie, which is one of the classes that Jess attends. And Agatha Christie is, of course, renowned for her murder mysteries. And that becomes a really key part of this book because Jess is very invested in Agatha Christie, because Lorna is also invested in Agatha Christie. But then as the book develops, we have some actual real-life mysteries and murders to contend with as well. And in that sense, I feel like this book could definitely be compared to The Secret History. That is obviously a book which is also focused on a murder, and the way that these two books, I think, are connected is in the sense that Jess is a retrospective, very conscious narrator who is reflecting on her first year university experience from the future. So we know from very close to the beginning of the book that Jess is no longer at university. She has passed that circumstance and is no longer there, and is looking back on these very dramatic and intense events of her first year of studies, and looking back on how these various instances, relationships and events led up to some quite dramatic conclusions. And I feel like that's really similar to the way that The Secret History starts, by introducing that a murder is going to take place and then going back and exploring how you got to that event. And so this is a book which does some really complex things, and I think just manages to do them all so well. And so I really, really loved it, and I'd highly recommend it if you've enjoyed any of Sally Rooney's books or The Secret History. The only part about this book which I found a little bit less than satisfactory was the ending, which I just felt like was a little bit underwhelming because it was slightly too open-ended for my liking. A book that, in my opinion, is marketed as some kind of murder mystery, I think should have a good conclusion. I think the literary choice of leaving this as an open-ended book was to reflect a theme that happens throughout the book, which is that there was a mystery of Agatha Christie's, which was when she went missing herself, and that was never solved. And I feel like this book and its conclusion was meant to reflect that. But it was just a little bit unsatisfying for me. But aside from that, really loved it, and I love the way that it portrayed complex relationships, so I definitely recommend it. Next up, I changed the pace a little bit with a romance and picked up In the Time We Lost by Carrie Hope Fletcher. This is a romance which focuses on our main character, Luna. Luna is an author who has just recently come out of a long-term relationship, and she kind of wants a change of pace. She's also dealing with grief, which has kind of left her feeling a little bit lost, so she takes herself out of London and over to one of the most remote places in Scotland, in an island just off the coast of the mainland. And there she is in this very strange situation where it's the middle of summer, and then they get this freak storm that allows everyone on this island to be snowed in, and it very quickly becomes aware that this is a slightly strange and almost like supernatural phenomenon, because they are waking up on the island and the same day is repeating over and over again. And so this is a romance in the sense that we have Jess meeting these same characters over and over again, and certain characters have these slightly difficult relationships with her at first, and then each day their relationship changes and develops without them even remembering what's happened before. But each time they meet, their relationship with each other and their response to each other kind of changes and becomes more and more like warm, friendly, and eventually romantic. So in that sense, I thought this was an interesting book because Groundhog Day is obviously a really interesting theme, and it was really quite cool to see that in a romantic sense. However, I do feel like the characterization of characters in this book was very flat. It wasn't very believable, and all of the characters did feel like characters, not like believable people. And then the ending, Jesus Christ, was awful. it wasn't like what I wanted from a romance book. I feel like anyone who picks up a romance wants a happy ending. That's kind of just a given, and this book was a bleak ending. So on the whole, I didn't love this book. It had a lot of promise in the middle, but it just didn't quite live up to what I was hoping for. I did, however, manage to get through it really quickly. It only took me a day to read, so if you're looking for a quick read, then definitely maybe give this one a try, but I'm not sure that I'd recommend it, especially if you're a big lover of romance, because this just isn't quite what I would have hoped for from this book, and I'm sure not what most of you would want from a romance as well. So the next book that I picked up in October was such an exciting read for me because it had been set up for my October TBR pretty much since the middle of summer, and that book was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I was reading this one in October because, along with Jess from the channel Read by Jess, I was hosting a read-along called Rebecca Long, which was in preparation for an anticipation of the new Netflix movie adaptation of Rebecca, which came out in the middle of October. This was a reread for me. I had read Rebecca before a couple of times, but it had been quite a long time since my last read, and it was really nice to be refreshed with this book and just sort of reacquaint myself with all of the characters, because the basic storyline was familiar to me, but there were so many details that I had forgotten about, and it's always just really nice to revisit an old favourite, and this was definitely a 5-star read. For anyone who isn't aware, Rebecca is a book which focuses on our unnamed protagonist, who we only know as Mrs. De Winter. We meet her when she is in Monte Carlo being a like companion for a rich old lady, and there she meets a man called Max De Winter, who she very quickly becomes romantically involved in and married to. Max is a widow who recently lost his wife called Rebecca, who's obviously our titular character, and then Max brings his new wife, who we never find out the name of, back to his house Manderley, and there they're meant to kind of just go about their married life, but it seems like Rebecca is almost a ghost haunting Manderley and everyone there. There is a housekeeper called Mrs. Danvers, who's definitely the villain of this story, who is a little bit obsessed with Rebecca and therefore really resents this new wife who she thinks is coming to take Rebecca's place. And there's also a lot of mystery surrounding Max's relationship with Rebecca and how their relationship concluded, the circumstances surrounding her death, and all kinds of other mysteries. But at its core, we have our main character gradually being sort of haunted and almost engulfed by this memory of a character that she never even met, who she thinks she has to live up to. And it's so interesting that we never find out her name, because she is just such a shadowed character by this woman who actually isn't even a character in the book, which is just so interesting and so clever. Like all of Daphne's books, it is did I just call her Daphne like we're friends? Like all of Daphne du Maurier's books, this is a really dark novel. There's so much mystery and intensity, and yet she combines this darkness with such beautiful imagery and such detailed descriptions, which just add to this picture of Manderley as a location and to this experience that these characters are going through, and I think she just does it so incredibly well. So I absolutely love it. If you haven't read Rebecca yet, definitely recommend. However, I'm not sure that I'd recommend the new movie adaptation. It was slightly disappointing. There is a live show up on my channel where Jess and I discussed this book and the live show, so if you want more thoughts, then you can go and watch that. I'll link it down below, along with Jess's channel as well. But essentially, it missed out a lot of details, made the book a lot more romantic than it was dark, which is definitely not in keeping with the novel, and I think made some changes that just didn't need to be made, and so I'm not sure that I'd recommend that film, generally speaking, but the book is incredible. Next up, it was time for my annual Stephen King 24-hour readathon. I didn't read as much as I'd hoped in this 24-hour period, but I did enjoy one of the books that I read, and that was Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, obviously. Dr. Sleep is a sequel to The Shining, so I don't want to say too much about this book because I feel like having read The Shining beforehand is important, and I would highly recommend reading The Shining, even if you have no intention of reading this book, because it is just incredible. But essentially, The Shining is about a family made up of Jack and Wendy, a husband and wife, and then their son Danny, and they go off to look after this big hotel in Colorado called the Overlook and be the winter caretakers. But once they get there, it seems that this hotel is much more than meets the eye, and there's a lot of paranormal, spooky, and downright terrifying things happening in this hotel, which is only exacerbated by the fact that this family is basically trapped there because it becomes so isolated and snowed in winter that really they are stuck there with nowhere else to go. And then on top of that, Danny as a character has something called the Shining, which means this ability to communicate with people, both in terms of being able to read minds and also as well as being able to communicate with people who are dead and spirits and just kind of really connect with the paranormal events that are happening at the hotel. So The Shining has quite a dramatic ending, and Dr. Sleep picks up 3 years after the events of The Shining. So Danny is 8 years old at the point that this book starts. We see him still very much coming to terms with the events of what happened in The Shining, and then very quickly we jump past his childhood into adulthood, where Danny is an alcoholic, really struggling with his life and kind of still being traumatized by the events of what happened. And I think it was really interesting to get this insight into how impactful what happened in his childhood was on the course of the rest of his life. So Danny is our protagonist in this book, although he goes by Dan now because he's a grown-up. So Dan is our protagonist, and he eventually ends up coming into contact through The Shining with a girl called Abra, who also has this shining ability. Abra has a really, really strong connection with The Shining, and they have this sort of like mentor-mentee relationship where Danny is trying to help her get along with what is going on in her mind and figure out how to cope with it. And then there's also a secondary storyline which follows a group called the True Knot. The True Knot are the villains of this story, and their purpose is essentially to find children like Abra and like Danny would have been when he was younger, and essentially exploit them for steam, which is essentially their power. So these children who have the Shining have this steam ability or something that the True Knot needs to live on. So they eventually are kind of hunting for Abra, and Danny and Abra's goal is to obviously destroy them. I did make some comparisons to this book and The Outsider, which is one of Stephen King's newer books, because I felt like The Outsider, the actual character, The Outsider in The Outsider, could I say outsider any more times? The Outsider is very similar to the characters in The True Knot, and I feel like the way that they survive is very comparative, and I was almost wondering whether or not Stephen King, having written this book first, gave him the inspiration for exploring that theme a little bit further and in more detail in The Outsider. But either way, I really liked this book. I thought it was really cool to get a follow-up to The Shining, to explore Danny and his character more, and also to get more of an understanding into exactly what the shine is and how it works. And I just really liked it. I definitely preferred the bits with Danny and Abra to the bits with the True Knot. Those characters weren't quite as compelling, but on the whole, I really enjoyed this book, and I thought that like the opportunity to learn more about The Shining and just to get that extra information and extra plot was really cool. It is a book that I think splits opinion. People either love it or hate it, but I definitely loved it and I definitely recommend it, and I ended up giving it 4 stars, mostly because it was good, but probably not quite as good as The Shining, which was 5 stars, so I ended up giving it 4, but either way, really, really good. And as I mentioned, I enjoyed one of the books that I picked up in my readathon. The other book that I picked up was If It Bleeds. Now, before I jump into what this book is actually all about, I would just like to say that this is an extremely misleading cover. If It Bleeds is the title of a story which is supposed to be a follow-up to The Outsider, following some of the same characters that we meet in that book. And so I thought that I was getting a whole other Outsider follow-up novel, which I was so excited about because I really, really enjoyed The Outsider. And the blurb of this book just basically gives you a description of The Outsider and how it's going to follow up to that. And so forgive me if I'm wrong, but I expected that this book was going to be a follow-up to The Outsider. And then when I opened the book up, as it turns out, this is actually a selection of 4 novellas, one of which is If It Bleeds, but 3 other ones I had no idea I was getting. Now, can you see anywhere on this cover where it actually says that it's a collection of short stories? Because I sure can't, and I was a little bit upset about that. Like, it isn't the worst thing in the world, but I spent I think 20 quid on this hardcover, thinking I was getting a follow-up to The Outsider, and then boom, it is not. It's 4 novellas, and so I ended up only reading 3 of the novellas. I am going to read the 4th one at some point, but I just didn't have time this month yet. But the 3 that I read were, let me just check, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, The Life of Chuck, and If It Bleeds. And as it turns out, If It Bleeds was actually a disappointment, so I'm kind of not that bothered that it wasn't a full story, but I just felt a little bit misled. So I'll start with If It Bleeds, because it is a follow-up to The Outsider, but actually it basically is just The Outsider 2.0, in the sense that one of the characters that is in The Outsider gets wind of the fact that there is another outsider-like creature, and then she takes it upon herself to essentially find and destroy it. And that is basically the theme of that story. And so it felt like the exact same plot as The Outsider, only without any of the drama, any of the tension, the dramatic time for build-up, or the fear. There was just something about the fact that the outsider in The Outsider had already been destroyed, which meant that you didn't feel quite the same sense of fear that you felt in The Outsider, because you knew that this creature wasn't infallible and they could be destroyed. And so there was that, and then also the fact that because it was a novella, there was way less time for description and build-up, so you just didn't feel the same connection and intense fear when you were reading this book as you felt in The Outsider. So all in all, I didn't feel like it was necessarily a much needed book. I didn't think it added much value to the world of The Outsider, and for me it was just a bit disappointing. Next up we had Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which was actually my favourite book of this novella collection. It was a novella which was very much focused on the mundane, just everyday life, and we focus on our main character Craig, who is a young boy, and he basically goes and helps out this guy called Mr. Harrigan, who's a rich person who lives in the neighbourhood. He ends up giving Mr. Harrigan, he reads for him and just kind of chats to him and they're friends, and this kind of takes place at the point where technology is leading off. So Craig gets the first iPhone, and he eventually gets Mr. Harrigan an iPhone as well, because he thinks it's going to be really interesting to him, because he's really interested in things like stocks and technology, so he thinks it's going to be a really cool way for him to stay connected. And so Mr. Harrigan and Craig basically have this relationship founded on how technology becomes so important to people so quickly, and through these two characters we see how quickly people become reliant on their sources of technology, and how much the introduction of technology and the development of technology impacts and changes the way that the world works, and how it so quickly becomes impossible to remember what life was like before that happened. And I really liked that. I just thought it was so interesting, so relatable, because technology is such a key issue and is something that is constantly developing, and yet it is really impossible to imagine life without technology. I mean, I'm literally sitting here with a camera in front of me, a laptop and a microphone, and I can't imagine life without technology. But it's really interesting to be at that sort of transformation point where technology started to become more accessible. And I really liked that. I'd compare this book to maybe things like The Body, which is another one of his books that is quite mundane and just focuses on real life characters. There's nothing paranormal, nothing freaky. It's just real characters and their lives, which I really like. And then the third story was my least favourite, which was The Life of Chuck. This one is described as a 3-act story told in reverse. So the first one is an apocalyptic story where the face of a guy called Chuck is being presented across the city as everything shuts down and basically dies, and we have this apocalyptic scene. In the next one, which is going back a few years, he is a businessman who's dancing to a busker's drum, and that one was the most boring. It was ridiculous. I just didn't understand what the point of it was. And then finally we go back to Chuck's childhood and see his relationship with his grandparents after the loss of his parents. And so in my opinion, the first act of the story, which was the apocalyptic one, was the only one that was interesting, but on the whole I just didn't really get what the point of that collection of acts of Chuck's life was, and I just didn't really vibe with it. So on the whole, wouldn't necessarily recommend buying this collection of novellas because they didn't really speak to me, and some of Stephen King's other novellas are really good, and I just didn't necessarily think that these ones were that good. So the final 2 books that I picked up this month were both of the picks that we'd chosen for the Dark Academics book club this month. It was really exciting because we got to read 2 books because we decided to do a bumper Halloween special, and the first book we picked up was The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. This is one of Emma's favourite books of all time, so I was really looking forward to reading it. but I didn't like it. I'm really sorry to say that because I feel like a lot of people did, but for me, I just didn't find it that interesting and I ended up giving it 2 stars. Luckily, it was only a short book, so although I didn't love it, it wasn't particularly difficult to get through. And it's a really difficult book to explore because there was nothing fundamentally wrong with it that made me dislike it. Like, I can't pinpoint why I didn't love it. It just didn't really connect with me, and I just didn't really find myself connecting with the plot, the characters, or just anything about it. To summarise, this is a book which focuses on a phantom of the opera house. He's called the Opera Ghost, and this opera ghost is quite an interesting character in the sense that he's obviously seen as this phantom and as something paranormal, but he's also quite a funny character in the sense that he demands a lot of things from the opera managers and is very, very clever in the way that he communicates with people. But the opera ghost, who's also known as Eric, also ends up in some kind of romantic relationship with another character called Christine. And this book kind of follows the complexities of this relationship and how they affect all of the other characters, concluding in quite a dramatic event. That's pretty much all I can say, I think, without giving away any spoilers, because it is quite a short book and a lot is packed into quite a small amount of pages. However, what I will say is that this book just didn't speak to me. The only character that I cared about was the opera ghost, and the parts that he was in were interesting, but there were lots of other parts where it wasn't really about the opera ghost and it was about other characters and their relationships with each other. And I just didn't find myself really caring about them at all, and I just didn't find it particularly compelling. However, this is a book that lots of people have enjoyed, and if you watch the Dark Academics live show, which was on Mary's channel, I'll link it down below, but essentially I was the one that disliked this book the most and everyone else really enjoyed it. So my dislike of it just comes down to my personal preference, but don't let that put you off if you want to read this book, because I'm sure a lot of you will enjoy it. But equally, reading is just so personal and sometimes you just don't find yourself connecting with books. And for me, this was one of those circumstances. And then finishing the month on a high, the final book that I picked up this month, which was the other book for the Dark Academics book club, was We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is a firm favourite of mine, just in general. This was definitely a 5-star read for me. I loved it. But I also knew that I was going to love it because it was a reread. I did read this book for the first time last summer and loved it then, and it was so nice to revisit and just remember why I loved this book so much. It's another really short book and I just think it's so incredible. I think it is a book which splits opinion because it's quite strange and bizarre and doesn't really have a coherent plot, and yet for me it's just incredible, and I think people either love it or just don't love it. Like, they really just can't get to grips with it. And I'm just one of those people that love it, which I'm so happy about because it is just incredible in my opinion. Because this is a book which is very bizarre and almost feels like you've fallen down a rabbit hole, it is difficult to explain, but to give a rough summary, we follow our main character, Mary Cat. Mary Cat is 18 years old at the start of this book, although she reads like a much, much younger child. And Mary Cat lives with her sister Constance and also her uncle Julian, and together they are the last 3 surviving members of the Blackwood family. All of the other members of their family died 6 years prior to the start of this book in a poisoning incident, which of course was considered as a murder, and there is a significant amount of mystery surrounding these family members because although there was a murder trial in which Mary Cat's sister was accused of the murder, that was unfounded, and so there is just a mystery surrounding exactly what happened. And we assume that of course one of these 3 surviving members of the family were the culprit, but you don't know who, why, or how they decided to do this murder, and so it's just really, really interesting. And yet, whilst the murder mystery definitely plays a part in this book, that isn't really the main part of the book, and I wouldn't describe this book as a murder mystery because Mary Cat, our main character, isn't particularly bothered about or consumed with the fact that the rest of her family was murdered, and so we're following her perspective, and so the fact that she's not that interested in it means that we don't get much chance to put any interest into sort of solving the mystery. And so really we just follow Mary Cat and Constance in their existence. Another family member who we didn't really know about turns up and causes a rift in the family, and you get the sense that he is there particularly to try and get something out of them. And yet there's also just this underlying tension between all of these family members because of the way that they behave around each other. The only two family members that seem to like each other is Mary Cat and Constance. They have a very close relationship which almost mirrors that of a mother and daughter, despite the fact that they're sisters. And there's also this sense of these characters being trapped in time. Mary Cat is obviously very childlike despite being 18 years old, and it's almost as though she seems to be frozen in time at the point where her family was murdered, and she hasn't aged past that point. Constance has stepped into this very motherly role, and then Uncle Julian is writing a book about the events of the murder and is very, very invested in remaining in that part of history in order to try and solve it. And so we have this very bizarre group of characters who are isolated from the rest of society and almost just frozen in time, living this very, very strange existence. And although not much happens in this book, it's not dramatic or very plot driven, it's one that I just find so compelling because I think the characters are so interesting and their relationships with each other are so intriguing. And so I love this book. It's undoubtedly a 5-star read, and I just recommend it if you are interested in a book that is dark, atmospheric, and a little bit weird. So there we have it. Those are the 7 books that I managed to finish throughout the month of October. And finishing those 7 books has taken me to a total of 71 books read throughout this year so far, which I'm really excited about because my goal for the end of the year is 75. So I'm so close and definitely going to finish that reading goal in November, which is really exciting because then I can really push it and see how far I can get before the end of December, which I'm very happy about because last year I only managed to finish my reading goal literally on the 31st of December. That was when I read book 75 last year. So I'm definitely ahead of that this year and really, really excited to see how far I get. And looking on the positive side, next week, or actually this week now, I guess when this video is going up, England is going back into lockdown, which in a lot of ways is very negative, and I'm not like the happiest about it just because it is a bit disappointing and disheartening, and like a lot of people, I'm just not looking forward to the prospect of a winter lockdown. But on the positive side, and trying to look at things with as much light as I can, it will give me an opportunity to do a lot more reading than I've been finding time for lately, and that is always a nice thing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how many books I do manage to read in November, and I'd love to know what you read in October that was your favourite thing and what you're most excited to read in November. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.